Welcome to Be Customer Led, where we'll explore how leading experts in customer and employee experience are navigating organizations through their own journey to be customer led, and the actions and behaviors employees and businesses exhibit to get there. And now your host, Marbu Brown.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be back with you on another episode of Be Customer Led, where we work really hard to bring you guests that deliver practical insights that you can use to move the needle for customer and employee experience in your business. I think we're succeeding at that, and today we've got another great program planned for you. You know, the CX delivered by government agencies like the DMV or the post office is one of those topics that the public loves to commiserate about. I mean, I recently made a post myself about the DMV on one of my hashtag CX Fail Friday posts. You know, during the political campaigns leading up to the 2016 and 2020 elections, there was no government agency that garnered more attention for its CX challenges than the VA. Well, that clamor has quieted down quite a bit, and our guest today can give us deep dive visibility into why that's the case. And beyond that, he can give us visibility more broadly into how CX in the public sector differs from the private sector, as well as what the two sectors can learn from one another. Our guest today is John Boerstler. He's the former Chief Experience Officer for Veterans Affairs and the current GM of U.S. Federal at Granicus. Welcome to the program, John.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm super glad to have you because I know you can share insights that are not necessarily common, not, things that people hear all the time. And I think it's going to be of great interest to all the people who are listening. So, John, I said a little bit about your background, but before we jump into this discussion about CX at the VA and in the public sector, we want our audience to get a chance to know you a little bit better. So can you share a little bit with us about your career journey, how it is you came to be Chief Experience Officer for Veterans Affairs, and now the GM for U.S. Federal at Granicus, which is your current role. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks again, and really excited to talk a little bit more about, obviously, a topic that we both hold dear in our professional and personal lives. It's good to have like-minded thinkers, right? So it's good. But yeah, I like a lot of folks who work at VA and who are in the VA ecosystem, so to speak. I served in the United States Marine Corps, so I joined the military when I was a young man at 17 years old. Wanted to see the world, wanted to serve my country, and got to do that, got to do all of those things. And when I was leaving service, I got a chance to then work on the Hill. So I kind of shifted from being in uniform and service to working in policy and constituent services and outreach for the House of Representatives, which was a really incredible experience, being like the only veteran on my team, but it really opened my eyes to like how policy is made and how agencies are overseen and conduct important programs. We also got a lot of inbound customer experience insights, as you can imagine, because that's one of the things people do is like call your congressman, right, or congresswoman, like when you have a problem. And this is when I was working there. It was during the middle of the passport crisis of 2007, where we essentially switched from, where you had to go to Mexico and the Caribbean. You now had to have a full passport of your ID. And that just threw everyone's summer vacation plans into a frenzy. And so we really had to develop standard operating procedures that were kind of quite foreign to a small office. And that was kind of my first experience in the federal civilian customer experience space. And I'm glad to say that Granicus is now a big part of making that experience much better. So I left federal service after serving in uniform and in the House of Representatives, and then went back home to Houston and worked for two mayors, which was really a unique experience working in local government, where the problems are much more right in front of your face, and trying to serve the public and ensure that they have good experiences And then I went into the private nonprofit sector where I got to continue my mission, but out of the government, which was a different mission set for me. Then went into the private sector for a bit and learned a lot more about how to build marketing and sales operations, which was really an important point in my career. And then kind of noticing the fragmented landscape of resources that were offered to veterans, but also underserved populations of all types, really gave me a unique opportunity, along with a bunch of my friends and colleagues that worked in the veteran service ecosystem, an opportunity to kind of rethink the model and how veterans access these resources. So we not only built a collaborative system called Combined Arms, but we also built a software platform to back that up, to essentially allow service members, veterans, and their families to access these services online, and then hold the agency or the organization accountable for how much time it takes them to respond. That really kind of got me into human-centered design, user experience, user design, and customer experience writ large. And from those years of building such a dynamic platform that served hundreds of thousands of people, I then became very much aware of the gaps in the federal policy between the Defense Department, Department of Veterans Affairs, Department of Labor, et cetera. And got very passionate about improving those experiences. And that's when I was invited or nominated to serve as the Chief Experience Officer in early 2021, which was an incredible honor and still is one of the great highlights of my career, where I served for 4 years. Left that role in 2024 on riding a high of great experience and successes, and now am back in the private sector working adjacent to the VA and all other federal agencies now at Granicus.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think sometimes people almost forget the federal agencies or it could be state or local government agencies that are serving the public do have a responsibility to deliver a high level of service to the public. And, going for Veterans Affairs, I think it was much more obvious because of wait times and all of those kinds of things. That sounds amazing. And we're going to come back and dive into that, much deeper. But for people who don't know, anything about Granicus, why don't you tell us a little bit about the company, what it does, and then we're going to get into our deeper dive regarding the VA and related things in the public sector.
Yeah, absolutely. So here at Granicus, and I had the great fortune of working with Granicus when I was at VA. So I'll start there. And cool. I have my own personal, professional experience and story working with the incredible Granicus team, and especially our Federal Experience Cloud, which is our secure kind of FedRAMP aligned engagement platform that's really purpose-built for government, co-designed with government to really modernize how federal agencies connect with the citizens they serve. So my experience is, especially when we're communicating with veterans, we had about 11 million subscribers, for example, that tuned in to one of our many bulletins and newsletters that we sent out. That audience is now up to 33 million, which is incredible that we've tripled in size. 2021 to 2026. It's February now, 2026. Incredible journey. And Granicus was a huge part of that, helping us as an agency kind of co-design along the way, not only by, helping our email communications, but our SMS and the way that we designed our collateral and thought about how we can really modernize this outreach, a multi-channel outreach approach, and also at the same time get those real-time analytics so that we could improve that channel outreach and that channel optimization. So it was really neat to work alongside the team at that point in time, especially as we launched into what we call the PACT Act implementation, which I'll probably talk more about later as we talk about policy drivers, et cetera. But that was really like the biggest expansion of VA healthcare and benefits to a number of millions of veterans who are now eligible for care. And Granicus was our primary partner in outreaching to those untethered or unaffiliated or unenrolled, however you want to call it, veterans who we needed to wrap our arms around. So really great opportunity to drive mission at scale.
Let me just clarify, and I think I understand it, but I want to make sure we do. So that tripling is who were eligible to be subscribed or were not, right?
It's a combination of things. So in terms of customers, like actual customers that we acquired, between 2023 and 2024, we increased the number of healthcare enrollees by 40%, which is due to that kind of outbound proactive SMS, multi-channel outreach. So SMS text, email, outbound outreach, mail, all kinds of different ways that we communicate with these veterans who were now eligible for healthcare and benefits. So that's one metric. So we engaged millions of unenrolled veterans and millions of veterans who are already with VA, but we're now eligible to apply for different healthcare services based on the new eligibility unlocked by policy in Congress. So there's obviously the whole journey of how a bill impacts the implementation there, which is a great experiment in public administration, of course. But for the subscriber network, we were able to grow. Anyone can subscribe and learn about what's happening at VA, especially through kind of the Vet Resources e-newsletter, which is our kind of primary public-facing agency-wide way to communicate with everybody, all stakeholder groups. That was at 11 million subscribers when we started in 21. Now it's at 33 million. Incredible. So it's due to a lot of the outbound proactive outreach driven by the PACT Act starting in 2022, but also just due to the incredible notoriety that you mentioned at the top that VA has gotten and improving trust or increasing trust and improving outcomes for veterans and their families.
Okay, cool. So that those subscribers could include veterans. It also include policymakers, other people who want to know what's going on. See that newsletter as a vehicle for doing that. Well, look, let's think in terms of CX in the public sector versus CX in the private sector. And I mean, what are some of the unique challenges of delivering exceptional CX in the public sector versus the private sector?
Yeah, wow. I've thought about this quite a bit because I have the distinct honor to teach a course at Georgetown. It's Georgetown University that's focused on customer experience and patient experience and employee experience within the public sector, but also healthcare organizations specifically. And there's quite a bit, but I'll focus really on 5 quick things. This is kind of how I, chalk it up, so to speak. So, measurement is one of the biggest differentiators. Like private sector companies use the Net Promoter Score, which is the Likert scale measurement. And in many cases, the federal agencies are using a variation of that in their customer satisfaction or CSAT measurement tools. But they also want to know about trust. And I know we'll probably talk a lot about trust at our North Star for VA, but that has become a metric or a measurement tool for many agencies, state, local, federal. Just because if you don't trust the agency that's committed and charged to deliver these programs and services to you, then why would you access them? There are other measures that we'll probably talk about, like ease, effectiveness, and emotion, in addition to trust, but also like time tax, like administrative burden. There are other measurements that the public sector really adheres to that's not profit driven. And so going from that comment there on the measurement side to profit driven on the private sector side, incentive is markedly different. Like in the private sector, you have market competition that drives the incentive and profit that drives the incentive to improve your customer experience. Whereas in the public sector, it's really the big drivers and the incentives are big policy change, like the PACT Act, as I mentioned, budget cycles, and of course, the ability to reflect and be held accountable by those entities like Congress or city councils or state legislatures that are charged with oversight of agencies.
You know what? You might just want to pause and say something about the PACT Act, because you've mentioned it a couple of times, and people probably don't necessarily know what that's all about. So remind us for a minute.
Sure. So the PACT Act was really the landmark bipartisan legislation that was passed and signed into law in August of 2022 that expanded VA healthcare and benefits to 23 new presumptive conditions related to the toxins that veterans may have been exposed to rather in combat or in training operations, both stateside here in the U.S. or while deployed abroad. And that really, like I said, opened up the aperture to millions of veterans who were now either already in VA care or more, in many cases, more importantly, not connected to VA care, provided us an opportunity to proactively reach out and wrap our arms around them and say, and see if we could enroll them. And that's when we really made that. Granicus really helped, supercharge that effort, right, as our partner. So
cool. So you were going to a third thing.
Yes, the third thing is really about choice. Like in the private sector, you could switch from if you're not happy with your Nikes, you could switch to Adidas, right? And you could go to New Balance. Versus in the public sector, there's only one IRS, right? You're kind of, I wouldn't say held captive, right, as a customer, but there is
you kind of are.
Yeah, there's no choice, right?
If you're going to file your taxes, you're going to go to the IRS, right?
Right. So you get really one opportunity to make that experience wonderful and delightful and effective for those individual citizens, and in many cases, government, if you look at the rankings industry-wise, still ranks quite low compared to other industry verticals. Now, there are outliers, of course, with high-impact service providers in certain states, like the Department of Motor Vehicles in California is a great use case in how they've been able to increase their customer experience capabilities, VA in the federal space, and a few others. But but writ large, we have to make sure that these experiences are effective. Obviously, when we talk about back to incentives, like what are besides incentives, like what are the goals of the agency? So versus the private sector. So private sector, obviously profit and shareholder value, depending on what type of company. And then in the public sector, it's like compliance and equity and access, et cetera. And then finally, the audience, right? If you're in the private, like related to choice, you can segment different customers easier in many cases in the private sector. Whereas in the government, in the public sector, we have to serve all regardless of their access and ability to need services and enroll in services and programs. So those are some of the top differences, I would say. And I would love to delve into that more in a paper, but maybe that's my next step as a Georgia professor. So,
well, it's kind of interesting because maybe some of those things aren't that far apart. Maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, I know that, when I was in the banking sector, J.D. Power took their retail banking study and kind of reoriented it to be much more focused on trust. And I think that some other companies in the private sector that are focused on private sector measurements have been reorienting some of their measurements around trust. So the whole notion of trust is a really big deal. And I can understand why in the public sectors, in a lot of ways, it's even more so, especially with an agency like Veterans Affairs. So when you think in terms of what constitutes a great customer experience in the government context, when you first joined VA, what did that mean to you, and how has that definition for you evolved over time?
The first few months that I was on board, it was in the the first few months of 2021 when COVID was still, a big part of all of our lives. The pandemic was still front and center. Vaccines were starting to roll out in February, and VA, the Veterans Health Administration specifically, was one of the first organizations in healthcare to receive like mass quantities of vaccines. And we had this unique opportunity to not only efficiently serve our existing patients and customers, but also pitch to those that had not been to VA for the first time an opportunity to have that kind of world-class experience, this aha moment. And I can't tell you how many I'm an Iraq War veteran. I can't tell you how many other Iraq War and Afghanistan War veterans that had never engaged with VA that went there for the first time for the vaccine, to get the vaccine, were just blown away by that experience. And so our first steps were on not only understanding how those experiences impacted those existing and new customers, so we measured that, but also how to communicate effectively to those customers so that everybody knew about it. So it was a rapid learning experience about, that's one way to learn your job, is when you're still in a crisis and you come in and you're helping lead a team that's already doing some great work on the career to VA employee side, and really just help amplify their efforts and force multiply their efforts. And so that was really a big focus, is like almost like a mixture of proactive and reactive customer experience posture in COVID. And then at the end of my tenure, it was really about how do we shape that new customer experience? Because in many cases, what we see based on all of the design insights, the qualitative ethnographic research that we did, is that the getting to veterans healthcare and getting to veterans benefits, like that first encounters that we have with them, are some of the worst, right? In terms of the pain points that are relayed to us and the friction points, the administrative burden. And so how do we smooth those out? So we really intentionally set out to improve the benefits experience when you're filing for disability claims, to improve the healthcare enrollment experience. And we really used, like I was mentioned earlier, the PACT Act, the toxic exposure legislation, to drive a lot of those new customer acquisition efforts through. And that in tandem with the biggest outreach and engagement and customer acquisition campaign that the department had ever embarked upon in 2022, 2023, and 2024, that I think paid massive dividends and acquired this whole new group of customers that now had a fantastic experience. And that's really building upon, as you mentioned, the 10 years before that we had really worked to improve that trust, ease, effectiveness, and emotion, and improve that customer experience since 2014.
It's kind of interesting because, when you think about the whole period, like you talked about when we were still in the COVID period, and I think about what it was like for us in a banking context during the COVID period, because whether people, think about it that way or not, banking was an essential service. Banks didn't close down because people have to have access to their money. One of the things that, was top of mind for us was with all the chaos that was going on around us, all the disruption, people needed a space where they could feel calm. And that was one of the things that we had to kind of be that cup of calm, if you will, in all of this tempest. And it sounds like you all were able to do some special things to give those veterans who are coming in for vaccines, experiencing the VA for the first time, some of that type of welcoming feeling and whatnot during that time. I want to pick up on one of the other things that you talked about. You talked about audience, right? For somebody like IRS got to deal with everybody. But in the VA, you got a well-defined audience. And there's a few companies out there that focus on a special audience. But talk about the audience differences, for example, when you're in a VA environment versus, like a scenario where, it's a regular healthcare type of a situation and you're not dealing with a specialized group.
Wow. Yeah. So the benefit of having the Veterans Experience Office, which, I think more and more agencies at the federal, state, and local level now have these types of functions, but to have an entire office and team dedicated to waking up every day, thinking about how we can improve those experiences and learn from the data that we were collecting it's truly a superpower for VA and for veterans like myself who use the VA healthcare system. I get all my healthcare from VA still. I was a secret shopper. Now I'm just a regular customer, and I still choose VA over private sector healthcare. Mm-hmm. But it enabled us to really segment our audiences by doing specific design sprints. So like ethnographic research on individual persona groups, whether that's like by a generation of veterans, like Vietnam era veterans or Gulf War veterans, or, post 9/11 Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, or women veterans, or LGBTQ plus veterans, or veterans that live in rural areas that have harder to access. We really wanted to design for all, essentially. And there are different pain points for each group that you can imagine based on preferences, based on access, based on technology capabilities. And we wanted to think about it from that perspective. But we also wanted, and I want to kind of always address the elephant in the room, is like there was a big healthcare access crisis in 2014 that created not only a leadership change at the agency, but also created the need for a Veterans Experience Office. It produced the Journey of Veterans map. It produced the trust scores, and then the rest is history. We've gone up markedly, and not only for our customers and scores, but also our employees, which I think is important. You can't have a world-class customer experience without a world-class employee experience. And I think that having that milestone moment really caused VA to reorient themselves. And then I came in fairly later, kind of midway through the cycle, and helped accelerate it as best I can from all the great work that had already been laid before me. And when we think about the negative narrative that VA as an agency has over it because of the bad press and all the congressional oversight that followed in that access crisis in 2014 that followed for years and to some extent still exists, we need not only veterans to trust VA and give us a try, but also, I say us, but give VA a try, but also, your neighbors and your coworkers, the general public, right? If your uncle or your mom or your best friend doesn't trust VA, then why would you, right? So that we really have to tell a better story and use the metrics that the VA healthcare system, the Veterans Health Administration outperforms civilian private sector hospitals by 40 points in the CMS, the standard CMS, Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services survey that's mandated across all public and private healthcare institutions. That's crazy. We need to get loud about that, right? And VA healthcare is built for us. That's kind of how I would say there's an audience of primary customers, but then there's this whole other audience of everybody else, the general public, to your point, that we really need to convince and get them to trust VA.
Was there a moment or an experience, either with a veteran or maybe one of the frontline employees that serves them, that really kind of made a difference in the way you think about service design in the public sector?
Yeah, I think just coming back to the data that I saw and the interviews that I helped conduct on the enrollment experience, both in healthcare and benefits, and it mirrored my experience too, right? I had not, I had a difficult time getting my benefits, and I didn't know how to enroll in healthcare. I didn't know what I didn't know because the information wasn't clear at that time. Mm-hmm. This is 2009. And I think about my own journey as well as millions of other vets, or maybe thousands of other vets that may have had similar experiences. And I think reorienting and redesigning and really focusing on those pain points at the beginning of the journey will really set us up for an entire lifetime of trust. The data shows that once you're in VA, you have a world-class experience, right? But it was those first moments, those primary moments that matter along that acquisition journey that really stood out as friction and administrative burden and just lack of understanding and communication. So that's when we partnered, with Granicus is to really kind of better understand that and then better segment how veterans receive that information, especially when you're transitioning from military to civilian life, which is a very difficult life transition in general because you're, stepping out of your uniform and into an unfamiliar world, being in a structured environment and with your comrades, et cetera. We were really, really taking a hard look at that because we saw the opportunity to smooth those pain points and turn them into really important bright spots. And so that was a major focus for us.
So interesting as you talk about that onboarding experience, if you will. I'm reminded of a scenario with one of these major tech companies wanted to poach an employee from another major tech company. And they worked at it and they worked at it and they worked at it. And they finally got this guy to sign up with them. And he resigned on the first day. And he resigned on the first day because his onboarding experience was not up to snuff for him. And they couldn't get, him set up with his computer and all of that stuff. And it was a huge wake-up call for them. And they went and reoriented a bunch of things because of that particular experience, right? And so what you say about this initial experience for a veteran signing up for benefits and stuff like that, huge deal. If you don't get it right, I imagine that you lose a lot of trust and they probably think about going elsewhere to get their services. But I'm glad, you're still getting your services and you're glad to do
proudly.
It. So when you think in terms of metrics that really matter, and you've talked about some of them, but are there some that are overrated and, some that are the precious few that you really need to just be dialed into?
Yeah. And back to you, before I talk about that, I want to go back to your point about the employee onboarding experience. It's funny because we noticed that not just like the customer onboarding experience, the VA employee onboarding experience had a lot of pain points. Mm-hmm. And that impacted, of course, the level of service and the level of attention and the speed at which you can get acclimated to your new role. And so we used a lot of the same principles to redesign the VA employee experience, which in tandem and parallel really helped improve the customer experience. So making those investments as an agency or as a private sector company are critically important, because you don't want incredibly qualified applicants resigning on the first day or
No,
90
you
days,
don't.
right? Yeah, that's a ton of lost time and resources. So I think it's hard to prioritize different data points, because at different times of your tenure, depending on the day and what's happening, you may be looking at a dashboard, so to speak, of different data points. For example, this is one of the most basic metrics that any enterprise will monitor, but it's like your call center metrics, right? And not just the customer experience related to that call center experience, but your volume and your drop rate, your call drop rate, and your average speed to answer. If those start getting into the red or yellow, then you really need to shift resources around and deploy resources to support that, because you certainly don't want people, dropping out of consideration for the hard healthcare and benefits that they have so rightly earned. So those are just kind of like operational metrics, I think, that are critically important, that complement the customer experience metrics. Obviously, trust, ease, effectiveness, and emotion were our big core customer experience metrics, but there's a myriad of other data points that we would look at, including the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid HCAP scores, which benchmark us across on the healthcare side. We also looked at J.D. Power, the National Cemetery Administration, which does all of our memorial affairs for veterans at the end of their lives, at the end of their life journeys. They're rated at the top of their industry, right? Just like the Veterans Health Administration. If you look at the J.D. Power and Associates awards for the best cemetery companies, the National Cemetery Administration is top, right? It's pretty crazy. And people just don't know that. So we look at a host of different metrics, and I don't want to downplay or diminish one data point or another, because they could be indicators of access issues. Like, for example, in 2020, early on in the PACT Act implementation, we had a big access problem with va.gov, which is our digital front door. You can submit your disability claim online, especially for these new veterans who had never accessed VA before. And it went to a dead form, I can't remember exactly, but essentially we had a broken link along the digital journey, and that caused many veterans to abandon their first disability claim or their second. And so that the intent to file form was the broken link, from what I remember. And we heard these indicators from not just our operational metrics, which validated that, but we heard it from our external stakeholder groups. They let us know that there was a broken link somewhere, and then we went about fixing it very rapidly. So there's so many different channels that I don't want to downplay one or the other, because it depends on the day. When you're running a Fortune 9 enterprise, we had to really look at everything.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting, because there's so much for us to talk about, and we're rapidly running out of time. So I'm going to ask you, in terms of improvements that were made, were there any that you feel like really stood out that, were kind of game changers in how veterans and the public saw, the service being delivered, by the agency?
Yeah, I think there were a few. One of the proudest moments, I think, that not only got a lot of attention, but also increased trust in VA and the federal government writ large, was the VSAFE effort that we launched, which is the Veteran Scam and Fraud Evasion. So this was like anti-fraud or fraud prevention and scam prevention efforts that VA co-chaired a working group across the federal agencies that had the authority and the resources given to them by Congress to enforce and identify different attempts at healthcare fraud or benefits fraud, or financial fraud that were, really targeting veterans of specific personas. And so we launched an agent or a government-wide task force that not only included veterans, but their families, caregivers, and survivors, and active duty military personnel and their families. So the tent was broadened dramatically between the Departments of Defense and Department of Veterans Affairs. And vsafe.gov is still active. We used our assets that, I now get to work on the Granicus side. We used our incredible outreach capabilities with SMS and outbound email tools to let people know about this, not just in the VA ecosystem, but federal government wide, whether that was the FCC, or the Department of Justice or the Department of Defense or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and many other stakeholders that partner with us. That, I think, helped increase trust and improve the experience, but also allowed veterans to help them identify moments of scam independent ways that people were trying to scam or defraud them, and then most importantly, how they could report that to the relevant agency.
It sounds interesting. And I'm assuming these are people who are trying to get veterans to go through them to get to the VA or something like that, and trying to get them to pay for services that they actually don't even need to be able to sign up and stuff like that.
There are so many different scams that there's like romance schemes, which are, impact regular Americans too. But in many cases, because veterans receive a disability compensation monthly, we're being targeted specifically. And, we had all kinds of different healthcare attempts and health insurance and memorial affairs even too. So it's kind of ran the gamut, unfortunately, but we stopped them. I think to a large degree helped stop them, or prevent them from accessing more veterans because we raised the level of awareness.
So if you were designing a CX playbook for the broader public sector today, what are the things that you would put on page one of that playbook? What are, like 2 or 3 plays you put on page one of that playbook?
Well, there is a VA CX cookbook that we kind of designed with OMB for the federal government, and we made some updates to that, which is pretty neat if you wanted to share that. But I think for me, it's like I mentioned earlier, is really improving that customer acquisition journey being number one. Whether you're a Vietnam veteran who has never accessed VA coming back 50 years after the war and interacting with it for the first time, or if you're a 22-year-old machine gunner getting out of the military today, we want that experience to be seamless. The second, I think, would be service recovery. And what I mean by service recovery is I think where VA really got it right is when we got these inbound surveys, of which there are millions every week. And there were different topics clustered around pain points. They would automatically get sent to the patient advocates or the benefits teams, and they would proactively reach out and wrap their arms around those veterans and help solve that issue. And I think that proactive outreach in the backstage systems that we designed really helped increase that level of trust, but also helped improve the outcomes for each veteran that had a pain point and had a negative customer experience. And then finally, I think employee experience. Like I said, you cannot have a world-class customer experience or patient experience or benefits experience without a world-class employee experience. You have to ensure that your employees have the right tools and the right training and the right support and the right mentality and ecosystem to thrive. Otherwise, you'll start seeing impacts on the customer side. So VA and the intervening years that we went from 55% trust when we started measuring it in 2016 to now over 80% trust today, which is an incredible achievement in 10 years. VA has gone from like the 17th best agency in the federal government to number 5. Right? No one's going to beat NASA. They're still number 1 and a few other agencies. But that in itself shows that you can't have one without the other. And VA continues to invest in that employee experience, even despite a lot of changes that have happened in the last year.
Cool. Well, John, I hate to tell you this, but we're out of time. So by the way, that cookbook, send me a link and I'll make sure that, we'll make it available to our listeners and, they can dive into that. But if people want to get a hold of you, want to continue this conversation, how do they do that?
Yeah, best way to keep the conversation going is to reach me on LinkedIn. I'm just John Boerstler, the one and only, I think. At least I hope so for that last name with so many vowels. Or you can.
And by the way, we'll display that on the screen so people can make sure they know how to spell that name right.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So it's a doozy. Sorry, apologies in advance. And then you can also reach me via email at john.boerstler@granicus.com.
Cool. Well, I want to thank you for joining us on the program today and for the insights that you have shared. I'm sure this has given people some other ways of thinking about CX and some aspects of it that they're not accustomed to thinking about all the time because, the context that you had to do this was a different context than people usually have to deal with, right? And then I'd like to thank our audience, for tuning in, listening to this program, and we thank you for being there with us. And like every time, I think you've been able to get some great stuff out of this, and we're looking forward to bringing you another program with these types of insights and nuggets next time. So again, thank you, John, for joining us. And to all our listeners, we look forward to having you join us again next time on Be Customer Led.
Thanks for listening to Be Customer Led with Marbu Brown. We are grateful to our audience for the gift of their time. Be sure to visit us at becustomerled.com for more episodes. Leave us feedback on how we're doing or tell us what you want to hear more about. Until next time, we're out.